Hello everyone, welcome to this episode of Slow Pitch Jigging California. On this trip, we're fishing the San Nicolas Islands in Southern California. We caught many new species on this trip, and I will be sharing some of the tips and tricks and some of my experience with you, so stay tuned on this episode. We started off fishing at around 5:30 a.m. when it was still pretty dark outside. I was using a 100 gram glow-in-the-dark flat-fought jig, and we're fishing around 100 feet deep water. After a few drops, my jig, as soon as it hit the bottom, it was hooked by something. And as I was reeling it up, I can feel that it is a bit different than the traditional rockfish. And it turned out to be a halibut. But I lost it when it was on the surface. And so it was my first hookup of the day. A great start. It's too bad I lost the fish, but it's totally fine. The condition today was pretty rough. Strong wind, strong current. And for most of the time, the boat was drifting when we were fishing. I think the captain was trying to cover more ground. But this poses a very big challenge for slow pitch jigging. As you all know, we need to stay vertical and we need to always be at the bottom. And with the strong current and the drifting boat, it's very difficult for me to really stay vertical with a light jig. And if I use a jig that's too heavy, the fish won't bite because most of the fish in this area are sheephead, whitefish, and smaller rockfish. After checking the bottom multiple times, the line was pretty tilted. I have a pretty big scope in the line, but after a few pitches, I still got hooked into a smaller rockfish. It wasn't a huge fish, but it was the first fish that I landed today, so I'll take it. After a few more hours of fishing with the drifting boat, I landed a few more rockfish. And almost all of those rockfish was caught when I got a chance to stay vertical with my jig. The water was about 80 to 100 feet deep, so I was using a 100 gram flat-fought jig for most of my jigging when the boat was drifting. I brought 2 pairs of jigging reels and rods today on this trip. I have the Shimano Ocea Jigger 2000 and also the Ocea Jigger 1500 F Custom. For the rods, I have the Shimano Game Type Slow J Medium Action. I also have my previously used Tempo Reef Innovate 8.0 Medium Action. For my Ocea Jigger 2000, I spooled it with 30-pound Uzuri braid, about 480 yards. And on top of that, I have the 50-pound fluorocarbon leader, about 15 feet long. So that's my heavier setup. For my lighter setup, I have the Ocea Jigger 1500 F Custom, spooled with about 450 yards of 20-pound Uzuri braid, and also about 15 feet of 30-pound fluorocarbon leader. The current was so strong on that day that at some point I was almost tempted to switch to my bait rod with a heavy sinker. And just when I was about to give up jigging, something magical happened. After casting upstream, and as soon as the jig reached the bottom when it was vertical, I got a hookup. The fish was definitely heavier than any of the rockfish I had caught, so I asked for backup, crew member with a gaff, in case I catch something like a halibut, but I don't want to lose that again this time. And as soon as I saw the sheepshead floating to the surface, I was so pumped. It was one of the fish that's always been on my bucket list for slow pitch jigging, and this was a pretty good sized sheepshead. The crew member said it was about 10 to 12 pounds. For the next stop, the boat went to a really deep water, about 300 to 400 feet deep, targeting big vermilion rockfish and potentially other large rockfish. Due to the strong current, I switched to my heaviest jig on that day. It was a 300-gram Jig Pro jig. I started off using the lighter setup with a 20-pound braided line, with the hope that it will cut through the water more easily. It took a really long time for the jig to reach the bottom, and as soon as I could feel the bottom, I started jigging, applying some slow pitch actions to the jig. Not long after, I felt a heavy hit on the jig, and as I was trying to lift the fish off the bottom, I think it was hooked onto something. Since the hook was stuck to the bottom, I opened the reel a little bit to let some line out so I can get unhooked from the bottom of the ocean. And luckily, I got out of the snag and the fish was still on. I really like this 300 gram Jig Pro jig in this scenario because it sinks pretty fast to the bottom, but it still has very good flutter action. On the second drop in this deep water, I switched to my heavier rod and reel setup, the Tempo Reef Innovate with the Ocea Jigger 2000, since my other setup and the line got tangled due to the heavy wind. And again, since the current was so strong, as soon as I lift the jig up, it got drifted away. So I had to constantly check the bottom to make sure that the jig stay on the bottom. With this particular fish, the hook was barely hooked. So I made sure when I was reading in the fish, since it was so deep, the water was so deep, I did it as calmly, as slowly as I could to not poke any hole in the fish's mouth. And on the third drop, a few pitches after the jig reached the bottom, I felt a pretty heavy bite. I didn't know what that was, but I knew it was a pretty big fish. So I quickly lifted off the bottom so the fish won't get me stuck on the bottom or on the reef, and then just started slowly reel the fish in. Finally, at the end of this video, I'd like to show you another species that I caught on another trip. And surprisingly, it was a black cod. People also call that sable fish. It was super delicious. It tastes almost like butter. And being able to catch that on a slow pitch jigging was just unbelievable. So that's the end of this trip, and overall it was a very difficult trip for slow pitch jigging with the strong wind and strong current. I was barely able to keep my jig vertical in the water. But overall, I was super happy, and my persistence got rewarded with new species of fish and also a great experience by itself. Thank you everyone for tuning in. I have some other exciting trips for the rest of the year that I cannot wait to share with you. I'll see you next time.